In 2015, a metallurgist at the University of Stuttgart named Alan Williams published the results of a decade of research. He had been examining Viking Age swords, not with the tools of archaeology, with the tools of materials science, X-ray fluorescence analysis, carbon content measurement, the specific technical instruments that reveal not what a sword looks like, but what it is made of, at a molecular level. What he found in a specific category of Viking Age swords, the ones marked with the runic inscription Ulfbert, stopped him. The carbon content of these blades was wrong, not wrong in the sense of being too low, wrong in the sense of being too high, too consistent. The Ulfbert swords were made from steel with a purity that, by everything known about 9th century production, should not have been achievable. Medieval iron smelting produced bloomery iron, iron extracted from ore using charcoal fires that could not reach the required temperatures. Bloomery iron contains slag, impurities from the ore and charcoal that cannot be fully removed without temperatures medieval furnaces could not reach. Slag makes iron brittle. The more slag, the more brittle. Every medieval sword made using 9th century technology contained slag. The Ulfbert swords did not, or contained so little that the difference in mechanical properties was measurable. A blade without slag inclusions is more flexible, more resistant to catastrophic failure, a better sword. By every mechanical measure, made from steel that 9th century Europe could not produce, should not have been able to produce, and yet it existed. Someone in the Viking Age had access to steel technology that the conventional historical narrative said did not exist. And then the question became, where did it come from? To understand the Ulfbert mystery, you need to understand what iron production looked like in the 9th century. Not in theory, in practice, in the smoke and heat and physical labor of an actual Norse smithy. Iron ore in Scandinavia was primarily bog iron compounds that precipitate out of iron-rich groundwater and accumulate in bogs and lake sediments over centuries. Not the richest ore, but available, widespread, harvestable without mining. The bog iron was dried, roasted to remove some impurities, then placed in a bloomery furnace. A clay-lined pit or shaft packed with alternating layers of ore and charcoal. The charcoal was lit. Air was forced through bellows to raise the temperature. The iron reduced from its ore but did not melt. It formed a spongy mass, the bloom, at the bottom of the furnace. A bloom of metallic iron mixed with slag. The bloom was removed while still hot, and hammered, repeatedly, folded, hammered again, folded again, to squeeze out as much slag as possible, to consolidate the metallic iron into a workable mass. This process is called working the bloom. It is physically brutal. An experienced smith working a bloom was doing something that required sustained heavy effort, at temperatures that made the working environment genuinely dangerous. And the result, after hours of work, was still not pure iron. It was wrought iron. Iron with slag inclusions that could not be fully removed by hammering. That gave the metal specific mechanical properties. Ductile enough to bend rather than shatter under impact, but not hard enough to hold a sharp edge under sustained use. A sword made from pure wrought iron would not hold an edge through a serious fight. The smith needed carbon. Carbon absorbed into iron during the forging process, through contact with the charcoal and specific heating, creates steel. Iron with carbon is harder than iron without carbon, hard enough to hold an edge. The challenge was controlling the carbon content. Too little, the blade is too soft. Too much, the blade is too brittle. The specific carbon content needed is approximately 0.6%. Achieving this consistently, using bloomery iron and charcoal forging without the ability to measure carbon content directly, is extraordinarily difficult, requiring years of experience, generations of accumulated knowledge, the sensory judgment of a smith who has made enough blades to read the heated steel, the behavior of quenched metal, the specific sound of hammer on blade, and know from these things whether the carbon content is right. Norse smiths were the best in the medieval world at this. Their pattern-welded blades were the technical solution to the slag problem. made by twisting and welding multiple bars of iron with different carbon contents together. It created a blade with better mechanical properties. Beautiful, sophisticated, effective, but still not what the Ulfberht swords were made from. Crucible steel. This is the answer that Williams arrived at after a decade of analysis. The Ulfberht swords were made from crucible steel, a specific metallurgical process in which iron and carbon-rich materials are heated together in a sealed ceramic crucible to temperatures high enough to fully liquefy the metal. When liquid metal cools, the slag floats to the surface and can be separated. What remains is steel of extraordinary purity, high carbon content, consistent throughout the blade, almost entirely free of slag inclusions, the mechanical properties that the Ulfberht analysis documented. Crucible steel was known in the ancient world. Wootz steel, produced in India and Sri Lanka, was the crucible steel that eventually reached the West. It became the legendary Damascus steel of Islamic smiths. The furnace temperatures required, approximately 1500 degrees Celsius, were achievable with ancient technology. In India, in Sri Lanka, in parts of the Islamic world, not in 9th century Scandinavia. So here is the question: how did Ulfberht sword makers, Norse smiths operating in the Rhine Valley and in Scandinavia, access crucible steel? They did not make it, they imported it. The raw material for the Ulfberht swords came from somewhere else. The evidence points to the same trade routes that were bringing Arabic silver to Scandinavia. The Eastern Way, the Volga trade route that connected Norse territory to the Islamic world, where crucible steel was being produced, where ingots of Wootz, the raw material for crucible steel blades, were available in the trade markets of the Caspian region. The Norse traders who were bringing Arabic silver home were also bringing something else, the raw material for the best swords in the medieval world, and the smiths who worked under the Ulfberht name knew what to do with it. They forged it into blades that no contemporary metallurgical tradition could replicate, and sold them across the medieval world, to the Frankish kings who tried to ban their export because they understood exactly how militarily significant they were, to the Byzantine emperors who paid extraordinary prices for them, to the Norse warriors who carried them from Iceland to North America. The Ulfberht name. It appears on approximately 200 surviving swords, spanning a period from approximately 800 to 1100 AD. 300 years. No single smith lived 300 years. No single workshop operated across 300 years of the Viking Age. The Ulfberht name was not a person. It was a brand in the medieval sense, a mark of quality, of origin, and of specific metallurgical capability, associated with a tradition, a workshop or guild, that maintained the knowledge and access to raw materials required to produce swords of consistent, exceptional quality. Because reputation in the Norse world was the most valuable thing a craftsperson could possess. It was worth more than the silver that paid for it. It was the guarantee that a sword marked with this name would perform under the specific conditions that Norse warriors knew they would face. Not all Viking Age swords were Ulfberht crucible steel. The vast majority were pattern welded, a technique involving twisting multiple bars of iron. Welding them under the hammer and grinding reveals the flowing pattern. The combination produced swords that bent rather than shattered under impact. Viking Age swords were tested, not by their makers but by their buyers. The saga literature describes specific testing methods. The blade was bent until the tip touched the crossguard, then released to check that it returned straight. A blade that didn't return straight was rejected. The blade was struck against a hard object, a helmet or a shield boss, to check for cracking. These tests were formal, conducted in front of witnesses. A smith whose sword failed a test paid the consequences in reputation, the currency that determined your social position and your work's future. The test was not consumer protection, it was quality control, enforced by the people who would use the product in situations where failure was fatal. Here is what the Ulfberht story tells you about the end of the Viking Age that most histories miss. The Ulfberht swords stop. Around 1100 AD, the production of genuine Ulfberht crucible steel swords appears to end. The name continues to appear on swords after this date, but the metallurgy changes. The later swords marked with the Ulfbert name are made from conventional bloomery iron, with slag inclusions, with carbon content that varies, with the specific mechanical properties of ordinary high-quality Norse swords, not of the crucible steel originals. Williams was direct about this in his analysis. The later Ulfbert swords are counterfeits, not necessarily fraudulent in the modern sense. The concept of intellectual property that makes counterfeiting a legal crime did not exist in the 11th century, but inferior products wearing a mark associated with superior ones, the name without the quality, the reputation without the substance. Why did the genuine Ulfbert production stop? The trade routes collapsed, the same political and military disruptions that ended the Abbasid Caliphate's dominance of Central Asian trade, the Seljuk Turkish expansion of the late 10th and 11th centuries, which disrupted the Volga trade routes that connected Norse territory to the Wood steel-producing regions, ended the supply of raw material. Without crucible steel ingots from the Islamic world, the Ulfbert smiths could not make Ulfbert swords. They could make the best swords that European bloomery iron allowed, which were still good swords, just not what the name promised. And the market, the Norse warriors and European nobles and Byzantine commanders who had paid premium prices for the Ulfbert name, was not told the difference. Because the name still sold, even without the substance. The most sophisticated metallurgical tradition in the medieval world ended not by superior competition, not by a better technology, by a supply chain disruption, by the collapse of the specific trade route that brought the one material, crucible steel ingots from Central Asia, that made the whole system possible. The blade was extraordinary. The supply chain was the vulnerability, as it always is. In 2012, a Norwegian blacksmith named Torstein Riisem set himself a challenge. He would replicate an Ulfbert sword, not a reproduction, a genuine metallurgical replication, using the same materials, the same techniques, the same production methods that the original Ulfbert smiths had used. He spent 3 years on it. He sourced crucible steel, not ancient woods but modern crucible steel with comparable properties. He built forge equipment calibrated to the temperatures and conditions that the original production had required. He studied every surviving Ulfbert sword that research access allowed. He forged and failed, and forged again, and improved, and came close, very close, but not quite. The blade he produced after 3 years, measured against the surviving originals using metallurgical analysis, was excellent, better than almost anything produced in the contemporary bladesmithing world. Not quite Ulfbert. Not quite the specific combination of properties that an anonymous Norse smith had achieved in the 9th century, using materials and techniques that the 9th century record suggests should not have been available. In conditions that the modern smith, with his controlled forge temperatures and materials science knowledge, could not fully replicate. Riisem's conclusion, after 3 years of trying, was honest. The Ulfbert smiths knew something that the surviving record does not fully capture. Some specific combination of technique, of judgment, of the knowledge that comes from making the same thing 10,000 times, that lived in their hands, not in any document, not in any analysis. In the physical knowledge of a smith who understood these blades at a level that cannot be transmitted through description, only through making. The 200 surviving Ulfbert swords are in museums and private collections across the world. Some are still sharp, 1,000 years old. Still sharp, still. Because the carbon content, freedom from slag, and heat treatment that some anonymous Norse smith applied in the 9th century produced an edge that the intervening millennium has not fully worn away. That is not a metaphor. That is materials science. A blade hard enough, pure enough, correctly heat-treated enough, holds its edge, across 1,000 years. The smiths who made them are gone. The trade routes that supplied them are gone. The specific oral knowledge that lived in the hands of the smiths who worked under the Ulfbert name, gone. The blades remain, still doing what they were made to do, still sharp, still waiting for whoever picks them up next. Picks